You might want to look at, those two markers are beside each other on the micronutrient profile, so you might want to look at those and just kind of see a trend. If you see a big imbalance in those, that might be an indication of why that patient might be progressing down that dysglycemic pattern. So you just have to look for that discrepancy between those two levels. Before I go into that next slide, one of the things I want to mention is iron was in here too. If you look at iron utilization, the previous slide that we talked about, they actually suggest that low iron is a risk factor for the development of diabetes. But the testing that I mentioned to you guys earlier, where I was looking at the scale from 1 to 10, ferritin's another marker on that. And if ferritin starts to climb high, then you're also going to see the development of diabetes. So the progression or the exacerbation towards diabetes. The extreme end, so highs and lows, body doesn't really like highs and lows, right? It kind of likes moderation. So same thing can be applied to iron here too. Vitamin D. Does everybody in here check vitamin D? Nobody checks vitamin D? So if you look at what vitamin D does, it's role in the pancreas. Vitamin D, as we know, is going to be responsible for calcium homeostasis, right? If you look at the proteins in the gut, so your calbinin is the one that's coming to mind. There's a couple of other ones that pick up calcium in the gastrointestinal tract. That is a vitamin D dependent protein. So it's going to pick calcium up. It's going to get it into circulation. But the other thing that it's going to do is it's also going to get it into these beta cells. And beta cells, if you look at what calcium does, calcium is it's an initiator of intracellular processes in the body. It's kind of like the ignition switch that tells everything you can go now. So to get that calcium in the body so that the beta cells can begin to release that insulin, you got to have vitamin D to make that whole process initiate in the first place. But if you look at what's happening in the patient, whether it's from the standpoint of traditional type 2, where over time they're increasing those inflammatory levels and that inflammation is beginning to feed back, it's beginning to destroy the pancreatic tissue, or you're actually looking at it from the autoimmune perspective, what vitamin D is going to do here is it's going to help stave off some of that apoptotic process, where basically as those beta cells begin to slowly degenerate, they just die off. The genetic message says, hey, it's time for you to go. Vitamin D is going to help offset that. So this inflammatory process that comes as a result of, again, whether it's driven by typical type 2 reactions or from an autoimmune response, vitamin D is going to have a hand in offsetting that inflammatory response. And there's a lot of literature we're going to look at here that really is geared around vitamin D and blood sugar. So this prospective study reports inverse associations between baseline serum vitamin D and future glycemia and insulin resistance. So the takeaway for me on this was future glycemia and insulin resistance. If we don't put that vitamin D back in there, we're setting that patient up for a dysglycemic state. Great, thank you.
What levels do you target?
I'm trying to get patients up around 60 on serum levels with this. If I can get them around 75 and keep them around 75, I like to do that, but 60 is kind of my minimum of where I want to see them at. So future glycemia and insulin resistance here. Mounting data strengthens the link between vitamin D, in particular type 1 and type 2. So again, it's not just one or the other, it's both. Right? And we also talked about that there's just as prevalent of an impact because of the way that the immune system regulates those different Th1 and Th2 responses, that you got your latent autoimmune diabetes could just as easily be added to this. But the point here is that the capacity of vitamin D, more specifically your 125 hydroxy, to modulate immune responses is of particular interest for both the therapy and prevention of diabetes. And hang on to this immune responses, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And just to further emphasize this, I know this is a little bit difficult to see, but what this says up here is it's elucidating the mechanisms by which vitamin D actually has this impact. And what this says is that the mechanism consists in the direct influence of vitamin D on nuclear receptors on genes coding proteins associated with normal beta cell function, or normal beta cells of Langerhans islands, and genes coding proteins ensuring normal function of the immune system. So it specifically pulled out the beta cells and it pulled out the immune system there. Okay, so let me use this for a minute to answer a question that comes up pretty commonly. If you look at serum testing for vitamin D, which I definitely recommend that you do, if you look at that and you also have at the same time you've got the micronutrient test, it is very common to see, and I have in one of my case reports, we'll look at this, it's very common to see that the patient will have suboptimal or deficient vitamin D levels in serum, but their micronutrient levels, their intracellular levels will actually be sufficient still, right? So what do you do with that? Do you treat it or do you not? You treat it. Right? You treat that, and I'm going to show you how that vitamin D shows up on the micronutrient apart from just the vitamin D itself to tell you there's a need there. It's not that the vitamin D in the micronutrient test is wrong. It's not giving you false information. What it's telling you is that the body is pulling that vitamin D into the immune system because, as this study alludes to, vitamin D needs to be in adequate quantities in the beta cells for glucose regulation, and it needs to be in adequate quantities in the immune system as your primary protective system in the body, right? So think about it being in different compartments. I always kind of think about when I'm talking to my patients about this, and I have to differentiate for them, I tell them, look, serum is telling me what's in reserve. Your beta or your intracellular levels are telling me what's kind of a critical point here, right? So if I see a 30 on a serum level, but I've got an ideal level on vitamin D, I'm still treating with vitamin D. Okay? Now, what I'll show you is an example on this, the way that you can confirm that, and the way that I have tried this numerous times with patients. And this is one of those things I can literally say it has worked every time I've tried it. You know, most things you can't say that about. But if you've got a calcium deficiency on the micronutrient test and the patient does not have an osseous condition, they don't have osteoporosis and osteopenia, any of that, and you give them vitamin D alone, it will fix the calcium deficiency. Okay? So that just goes to speak to the significance of that vitamin D acting on those protein-dependent, or on those vitamin D-dependent proteins in the gut to pick up calcium. But looking at what we have been talking about, predict an increase in risk of future cardiovascular mortality. So that vitamin D and its relation to diabetes, there is definitely a predictive nature about this. Okay. Just another study here to confirm this, independently predicted better beta cell function and lower area under the curve glucose at follow-up. Biotin. Our results suggest that biotin deficiency promotes hyperglycemic mechanisms such as increased glucagon concentrations and decreased insulin secretion and sensitivity to compensate for low glucose levels. One of the main effects of insulin, apart from the just trying to push glucose into a cell in addition to acting on those insulin receptors, is it downregulates the activity of glucagon. So if you think about kind of in the big picture here, why, even though a lot of times it's not ideal for patients, let me rephrase that, why it's not ideal for patients, period, to have increased insulin levels, to have insulin spikes, it's better than in some progressed scenarios than if they didn't have insulin and they couldn't shut down the activity of glucagon, which is turning around and just putting glucose back into the bloodstream. Right? So we want to make sure that we're doing things like the biotin here that are going to also have impact on glucagon, so it won't continually force glucose back to the system to try to further drive our body into figuring out, well, how do I deal with more and more and more glucose? Okay? Something as simple as biotin makes that happen. I mentioned alpha lipoic acid a little bit earlier. This is looking specifically at the Schwann cells, looking at your myelination here around the nerves. More importantly, this was something, I found this pretty interesting when I picked this study up. The cytotoxic effects of intermittent high glucose was significantly more potent than that of high glucose. So what I take away from that is that fluctuations in blood glucose are more of a problem than just an overt high blood glucose level. Right? So if you're seeing that in your patients, if they're showing up with indications of both hyper and hypoglycemia, this may be something to think about with them, and why it's so important to get a hold of that really quickly and take action on it. But as it related to this, alpha lipoic acid offset the oxidative stress and the apoptosis associated with those, so they can maintain the integrity of that myelin and not end up with those diabetic neuropathies that they see at those progressed states. Okay, Spectrox. When I look at that Spectrox marker, the first thing that's going through my mind is there's an inverse relationship there. As inflammation goes up in the body, your Spectrox marker is going to go down. Your total antioxidant function is going to go down. As your antioxidants are going up, your inflammation is coming down. So there's an inverse trade-off there. And what you're looking at with this is that recent studies have shown that type 2 diabetics patients have increased systemic inflammation and can induce beta cell dysfunction death. Well, how do you know, or how could you insinuate that a patient is progressed on the micronutrient test to that degree, or that they have the potential to progress to that degree? One of the things that you can look at is this antioxidant function here, or this total antioxidant function that they classify as Spectrox. Now, I also want to point out one of the other things that you'll see. Two things that I've noticed over the years in looking at this Spectrox marker is that you've got the Spectrox marker, and you can see this in your sample report. You've got the Spectrox marker, and then under that section you've got your total antioxidants. And a lot of times what you'll see, I shouldn't say a lot of times, sometimes what you'll see is that you'll have a low total antioxidant function, and the marker that I'm trying to shoot there with is I want to see that above 65%. I tell patients from the get-go on that one, I'm not happy with that one being in the yellow. That one's got to be in the white area. Otherwise, you've got some type of, even if it's a low level of chronic inflammation, it's occurring consistently. But my point there is that when that Spectrox is out of range, if you look at all the individual antioxidants and they're still within normal levels, let's say that they're not even marginal, they're all up at sufficient status. What do you make of that? Their individual antioxidants are good, but their overall total Spectrox is not adequate. Well, what you have to do there is you go back to the first page on the graphs and you pick up the other antioxidants. So you look at things like the vitamin D, the vitamin A, those have antioxidant properties. And then you begin to think about your superoxide dismutase as an antioxidant system. So that's going to be a manganese, zinc, and copper-dependent system, or copper-dependent enzyme. So you can also see marginal or overt deficiencies in those molecules or in those elements, and that'll clue you in as to why maybe some of that inflammatory response is still occurring in the Spectrox, even though you don't see the individual markers there. I'll also tell you that when you're looking at trying to replete the Spectrox, one of the things that really works for this is to think big picture, okay? Think about trying to suppress the inflammation. If I find the inflammation and I deal with it, then the antioxidant status will come back up, right? It doesn't mean you can't put some antioxidants in there to facilitate it, but it'll come back up. That makes more sense than just trying to give antioxidants and not addressing where the underlying inflammation is coming from. And what I think will really help you on this is that when you're trying to, when you find those nutrient deficiencies, those antioxidant deficiencies, let's say it's a selenium and a vitamin E, rather than thinking about that as just giving us selenium and vitamin E, maybe think about it from the standpoint of throwing a plant-based antioxidant in there. Something that's broader spectrum in nature, that has the ability to have a more systemic anti-inflammatory response, and it's actually going to get in and start hitting some of these cytokine-based inflammatory pathways, and doesn't just try to replete selenium or vitamin E. Not that repleting selenium or vitamin E is a bad thing, we just want to be more big picture in how we're thinking about that. Mentioned earlier the fructose insensitivity. You know, really when you're thinking about this, think about it as fructose intolerance. It's an overload of fructose in the system that just can't be metabolized. And ultimately what that runs you into is the liver's just not going to be able to process that amount of fructose. You're going to bog hepatic function down. Things that you can see that if you are correlating different markers from some of your other labs, your triglycerides going up, your uric acid going up, those are all going to be things that you're going to see probably at the same time with that. Just to give you the validation on this, in addition, some observations suggest that fructose may trigger hepatic inflammation and stimulate development of hepatic fibrosis. So you really got to be careful with that, with the fructose. And a lot of times, you know, when you change a patient's diet, patients are kind of funny because they'll want to increase their fruits and not so much their vegetables sometimes. Well, this is one of the markers you can go back to really guide them against doing that with. You can say, look, you know, you're overwhelming your liver function. That's not really putting them in an ideal state either. Okay, so that's more of the hyper side. Let's look more at your hyperglycemic side and how that's going to show up in the micronutrient testing. So the main nutrient that's going to clue you in on this is going to be your B5. And it really boils down to looking at B5 is going to be your precursor going into your cholesterol. So you're going to be B5, acetyl-CoA, and then you're going to get into your cholesterol production here, which is going to feed all your steroid hormones. One of the things as a side note on this is if you see low B5 and you have the marker on the micronutrient test for choline, so if B5 is going to acetyl-CoA, and then if you drew another arrow in here from choline adding to acetyl-CoA, you've got acetylcholine, right? Which is going to facilitate your neurological activity, your brain speed, mental capacity, memory. So if a patient's telling you that they've been hypoglycemic for a long time, they probably haven't had adequate acetylcholine production for a long time either. So that may be as equally of a contributor as lack of glucose not getting to the cells to facilitate neuron function. But here's what this looks like, and the reason that this is continuously driven, and the reason you end up with these B5 deficiencies, it all comes back down to cortisol and its action, its predominant action as a glucocorticoid. It's trying to help us out, right? I mean, that blood sugar drops, we kick in cortisol, we bring it back up, but it's all at the expense of this, and there's only so much panthenate or B5 around. Now, when this is starting to become a little bit more of an established pattern for the patient, you're going to get into seeing serine deficiencies in vitamin C. And the reason that you see these serine deficiencies is because cortisol is going to desensitize the hippocampal region in the brain, and serine is what the body is trying to use in its phosphorylated form to go back in and resensitize that. So it's trying to preserve that short-term memory center in the brain. Your vitamin C has a protective mechanism also. We're familiar with talking about the adrenal glands and the adrenal glands secreting cortisol, but the adrenal glands also secrete vitamin C every time they secrete cortisol. The role that vitamin C plays here is vitamin C acts as an antagonist of cortisol on the insulin receptors. So whereas cortisol downregulates that insulin receptor, the vitamin C is going to offset that downregulation. So again, it's a protective mechanism. That's why if you some of you may be associated with this. If you look at some of the old school talk on adrenal glands and how do you fix adrenal glands, it was vitamin C had to be in the formulation to make that happen. We may not have known the exact mechanisms, but we knew vitamin C had a role in it to help, that that's the exact mechanism on how it does that. This is a good book if you don't have this. If you can find one, they're out of print now. I would highly recommend picking up this book, the Drug-Induced Nutrient Depletion Handbook. But you know, some patients need to be on medications. Just bottom line, they got to be on them to get control of some of these scenarios that they're in. But you know, medications, for good, better, or worse, they're going to have some effects that we need to be conscious about, and then we need to offset. Because if we don't offset some of these impacts, then all we're really doing is allowing the patient to further progress down their state of dysfunction. I'll give you an example here. With metformin, you've got B12, folate, and CoQ10. So metformin is known to cause deficiencies in these nutrients, right? And in your packets, you've got a handout that actually breaks down your drug class and the nutrient deficiencies that are associated with that, and what the effects, you know, what effect on physiology is that having. So you've got that, and if you're just getting going with this, that's a great place to start with patients sometimes. Just hand it to them, or even you know, look through it, put it in your chart, have your staff put it in your chart, and when the patient comes in, have your staff circle the medication class that patient is on, and bring that up as a topic of conversation of a rationale for why they need to do this. Now, the even further why of reasoning that they need to do this. So for example, in a scenario like metformin, where it's depleting B12 and folate, on the back side of that, if you're decreasing B12 and folate, you're also running under hypomethylation. You're increasing your homocysteine, another marker for inflammation. So you're further deteriorating. You know, let's just pick on a traditional model here for a minute and say cardiovascular disease. Well, we know homocysteine is associated with cardiovascular complications. So we may be further setting them up for cardiovascular complications at the expense of getting metformin to try to control their blood sugar. But we can easily offset that by supplementing the B12 and the folate and checking it with the micronutrient test at the same time. If you look at the mechanisms, the fact that B12 is a deficiency secondary to metformin is pretty well established. If you look at what the potential mechanism behind that is, it seems to be that it drives malabsorption of the B12. And as alluded to in this study, in conclusion, patients with type 2 diabetes showed normal extracellular vitamin B12, so your serum B12, but disturbed intracellular B12 dependent biochemical reactions. So, here's a rationale for why you would want to further look at the micronutrient test. Here's something that's interesting though, and I wanted to put this slide in here to differentiate the serum and the intracellular. But if you go on to read the rest of this, it says metformin treatment was associated with low serum vitamin B12 and improved intracellular vitamin B12 despite low serum vitamin B12. I don't get that, right? I don't get that finding, and clinically that's not what I see. I see that it's going to be, if a patient's on metformin, it's going to be low intracellularly too. Bottom line on this is, you can't trust those vitamin B12 levels here, okay, or the serum vitamin B12 levels. You want to look intracellular with this. This is just a snip out of what that handout you guys have looks like. So looking at what the potential complications associated with that deficiency would be. Here's some of your repletion recommendations on this. For your hypoglycemia, you're looking at for your B5, anywhere from 50 to 500 milligrams here. Your phosphorine, again, thinking about maintaining short-term memory centers in the brain, that hippocampal region. 200 milligrams is pretty much a starting dose on that. If you've got somebody who's a little bit more progressed, I would definitely recommend going above 200 milligrams there. Vitamin C, 600 to 500 or 5,000 micrograms on that. You can go above that. It depends on what your comfort level is with vitamin C. I've seen some pretty interesting stuff in having glucose levels pulled down with doing pretty high dose vitamin C, so it definitely will work. And then food consumption every 2 to 3 hours, and basically looking at all the mechanisms that are potentially driving this, and the pattern sheet that you have. Trying to think about these mechanisms. You've got a handout that's got various patterns on this. And we were talking earlier, there are other patterns that should be added into that we're going to try to work with the lab to help them modify this sheet for you guys. But if you think about those patterns and you're looking at the micronutrient test, when you see patterns of nutrients pop up, try to identify what's driving that pattern and then try to circle that back to maybe this glycemic state or whatever their other state of dysfunction is. On the hyperglycemia side, your chromium, 400 to 600 micrograms there. Lipoic acid, 600 to 1200. If you're really trying to be therapeutic with this, if you got something like a diabetic neuropathy, I would certainly recommend erring on the high side with this. Maybe even nudge it up even a little bit more there. Niacin, 50 milligrams. And, you got your different forms of niacin here. Zinc, 30 milligrams. If you're looking at some of your forms like your zinc glycinate, that works. 30 milligrams will take care of the micronutrient deficiencies pretty consistently. Magnesium, 400 to 600, your biotin, vitamin D. Again, on the vitamin D, my starting dose for most patients is going to be 10,000 units of vitamin D. Find where your comfort level is on that, but 10,000 most patients will need 10,000. Most of your patients, like if you've got a true type 2 diabetic presentation, your patients are probably going to need more than 10,000 units a day. They're going to be really resistant to getting those vitamin D levels up. So if you do 10,000 in a person who's got a less than ideal anthropometric presentation, then don't be scared to go up above that 10,000. Just keep track of it in the serum for them. I've overshot 2 patients with vitamin D. Neither one of them had any adverse reactions to it. And one of them was a little small frame lady. So if somebody was going to have a reaction, I would have thought it would have been her. She had no reaction to it whatsoever. So I'm not saying that to recommend doing it. I'm just saying just track your patients. Your B12, 2 to 4 milligrams. And I do recommend with the B12 that you make sure you're incorporating folate in there as well. Anytime you give B12 or folate, in the absence of the other, you're running the potential to increase the, or running the risk to increase a megaloblastic presentation in the red blood cells. And then the paleo diet. I'm a big paleo guy. It works. I see great results with it doing this, so that's just kind of my little input into this. But hey, I got a scientific study to validate, right? Preliminary intervention studies using complementary or contemporary diet based on Paleolithic food groups, and look at what happens here. Promising results including favorable changes in your C-reactive protein, HbA1c, blood pressure, insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, and lipid profiles. Okay? So my thing on this is when you're looking at the micronutrient test and you're making those supplemental recommendations for the patient, you want to make sure that on the back side of that, you're helping address, again, the causative factors that drove that. Diet is generally a causative factor in there. So, you know, whatever works for you clinically, I just prefer the paleo diet. This is a slide that these are numbers I've just looked at and kind of picked up over time, trying to correlate things together. Your insulin levels. I tell my patients initially if they're over 10, I tell them, look, we got 2 cutoffs. My working algorithm for you is I want you under 10 initially. When you got to under 10, we call that a success. It doesn't mean we're done with the journey, but that's a success point for us, okay? Things really seem to change once a patient gets their insulin under 10. My next ideal level is to get them under 4. And just so you know where I'm pulling these numbers from, this is the insulin level that I'm using on this is from the LPP that Spectracell offers. So that's what insulin level I use. The other tests that I've mentioned a couple of times, their ideal insulin level was actually under 2. So you'll kind of have to gauge on this a little bit. But my feeling on this is that if I've got a patient's insulin level down like that, then they're not getting insulin surges. I will tell you that from about 4 to 7, I don't see a lot of complications with patients, but I just kind of feel like if they're really on top of everything and they've really got a handle on their health, they'll be down around 4 and they won't be getting insulin surges. Your glucose levels, 85 to 100. Most labs will use 100 on the top end. A lot of them on the low end run down to 65. It's just too low for patients. I really tell patients 85 to 90 is where I want you at. And again, this is one of those things I've just kind of watched over time. You look at that, and then again, you think 65 to 100, oh my gosh, that's this big range, and you're telling them to get in here. If patients are really doing what they're supposed to, they don't really have difficulty getting in that tight range and maintaining it. So,
do you use that rather than the A1C?
I use the A1C also. I do use the A1C also. And I try to get them 5, 6 or less on A1C.
Is that fasting?
These are fasting numbers. These are fasting numbers. And just using insulin as a marker, basal hyperinsulinemia in normal glycemic adults constitutes an independent risk factor for metabolic deterioration to dysglycemia. I'm probably preaching to the choir in saying this, but just looking at glucose by itself, it doesn't work, right? The way I instruct my patients on this, look, your body is going to do whatever it can to hold on to an ideal glucose level. It will disrupt everything around that glucose to maintain that. When you think back to one of the early slides where we had dysglycemia in the center, it will disrupt a whole lot of things around that dysglycemia, right? So, you know, if you're looking at the triglycerides and they're elevating the insulin, looking at these various micronutrients that we've talked about, those are all predictive that if we don't do something about them, the patient's going to end up in a dysglycemic state. So let's look at some case studies here. So a 25-year-old female, 5'2", 161. You can see her body fat, definitely a little higher on the body fat here. Total body water percentage, this is, you guys may look at this a little bit different in your clinics. As I look at this in my clinic, this is a marker or a measure for lean body tissue. So, you know, if they're below this 50, I look at that as there's an imbalance between lean muscle tissue and fat mass, which the body fat, you know, if we didn't look at anything else, that would bear that out for us. But that's just kind of how I view that. Chief complaint of muscle aches and severe unrelenting fatigue. Tired after eating, okay? So now we're beginning to think maybe more of a hyperglycemic pattern, especially after lunch. And then 3 p.m. it's worse. Okay, with 3 p.m. worse, that's kind of trending back towards hypoglycemia again, right? Still hungry after eating sometimes. Breast tenderness just prior to menses, okay? PMS, memory is getting worse as of late. This sounds like our presentation, doesn't it? This is what her micronutrient tests look like. And as a sidebar on here real quick, guys, one of the things I highly recommend you do is tell the lab you want borderline deficiencies included on your report. They are very helpful to have. on the front page, tell them you want that on there. It'll be on the graphs. It'll have the yellow section on the graphs. But what I've noted out of patients is sometimes patients won't really pay attention to those. Those are relevant. If the patient has a breakdown in their biochemistry somewhere where that nutrient is relevant, you got to address that, whether it's in a marginal state or not. So make sure you tell them you want borderline deficiencies noted on the initial page so patients begin to clue into that. But what we've got, B12, zinc, oleic acid, and chromium. Remember earlier when I was giving you the association between your oleic acid, omega-3s, and your PPAR activity? This is an example of it right here. Okay. Some further testing. Looking at the insulin levels here. Insulin levels aren't that bad. Homocysteine, right at 7. 7's my cutoff on this, so they made it right at it. But look at this one. This is your omega-3 index. So you can actually see that this patient does have a low omega-3 index. So you definitely see a correlation there between the oleic acid and the omega-3s here. On this particular report, she had a high estradiol and a low testosterone, so certainly more of an estrogen dominant state based on these two markers. So thinking about biotransformation, maybe even potentially a little bit of a leaky gut, intestinal hyperpermeability there. And then my intervention strategy on this one was doing a metabolic support formula. I'm going to use that terminology through a couple of these case studies. Basically what that is, rather than having to give the patient chromium or give them zinc, give them lipoic acid, it's just a formulation that I use that has it all in there just to maintain patient compliance. So they're not taking too many pills. But if they need it, they got to have it, right? B12 and folate, again, always want to dose those two together. Omega-3s, normally what I'm trying to shoot for omega-3s is minimum 2 grams, probably trying to get them up around 4. You can certainly go higher than that. And some of these patients, I've had to go 8. In my patients that are definitely of a little bit heavier body composition, doing 8 grams a day is not out of the question. And in her case, we did some of the estrogen receptor modifiers, so the black cohosh, Vitex, some of those more traditional ones. And the vitamin D, definitely a 10,000 a day on the vitamin D. And then paleo diet. This is a good one, and this is the one I mentioned to you earlier where when I was reviewing it this morning, it was like, oh, why didn't I draw the connection on these antibodies? Because I bet if I check this patient, she's got the antibodies. So 57-year-old female, 5'3", 165, weight loss, resistance, and fatigue, family history of breast cancer, so potentially something going on there with methylation, impact of estrogen as it relates to biotransformation and whatnot, former smoker, so her antioxidant capacity is going to be down, severe brain injury, so great, now she's got probably overactivation of the microglial cells in the brain, so we've probably got some neurodegenerative impacts here. Feels no difference after eating, okay? Diet is high in carbohydrates. Her diet was pretty carbohydrate dominant. She did not like proteins. Job is sedentary and high stress. Okay, now we're starting to see the stress physiology play in. And then she started noting a slight decline in memory. I'll tell you this too, she stated a slight decline in memory. With my interaction with her, I felt she had very slow communication with me. It wasn't like it was like slow speech, but you know how when you just interacted with somebody, it's almost like everything isn't just firing like it's supposed to? That's the feel I got back from just interacting with her. So I just kind of put that as a note. So here's what I saw with her. HbA1c, 5.8, okay? So she crossed the threshold. Vitamin D, 31. And then if you just kind of looking at some basic markers in here, the results off the micronutrient, abnormal glucose interaction, and the chromium. So definitely for her, getting this chromium back up is going to have a pretty dramatic impact on this glucose insulin interaction. She didn't have anything going on with D3, so we know hers is pretty much just chromium dependent there. Looking on the end down here, B12. One of the reasons that I put the B12 in here as a marginal is on this previous slide, this MCV here, it's high. It's functionally high, right? It's not out of range, but it's functionally high, so we know we got a correlation with some B12 folate potentially there. B12 in this case. Carnitine, thinking about her lipolytic pathways, getting those free fatty acids in the mitochondria to be utilized for energy. Carnitine has a role in that. Oleic acid, again, just from what I've told you, would you expect her to have a low omega-3 status? Yeah, right? And then getting into looking at the manganese. Think about manganese. The two areas I typically think about this are going to be in your detoxification systems and in that superoxide dismutase enzyme system. Calcium level. You'll notice I don't have vitamin D on here anywhere, right? But remember, she's a 31. So if you're seeing that a patient has a low calcium, think about giving them vitamin D. That's the way to fix that. And again, the only time I really start adding more calcium into this picture is if I've got an osseous malady that I need to deal with, osteoporosis, osteopenia. That's when I start thinking about adding some more calcium in there. Very typical with her zinc. You know, thinking about this glucose-insulin interaction, zinc levels trying to make more insulin here. Copper's good, so you do see a discrepancy, which looks like those are really starting to kind of separate a little bit here. So you're that ratio, just kind of take note of that. And then magnesium. Clinical picture for this lady does not look very good, does it? So your vitamin D.
The other thing you're going to want to look at is her hormones, because brain injuries, 40% of them have decreased growth hormone and testosterone production, which is regulates all that.
Right.
And adrenal glands too. I mean, of course, good afternoon fatigue.
Right, which I'm going to show you here in just a minute. I'm glad you brought that up. Looking at her lipid profile here, really if you look, let's kind of focus down on the inflammatory section here. Her CRP is at a 5.6, so over 5 times what would be considered ideal. We want her down around 1. Her insulin levels are at a 6.5. Now, just thinking about that, I would think her insulin levels would be a little bit higher than that, right? Just kind of based on what we've talked about here. So now, this is where I thought about this. I was like, wait a minute, what was causing her insulin not to come up? Could she not make it? Hold that thought. Homocysteine. Homocysteine at 9. So going back and thinking about your B12 and folate here. You brought up the cortisol. This is her adrenal stress index. That's pretty out of range, huh? She's elevated at every point, and then